Qatar Airways just had, by almost every measure, the best year any airline has ever had. It won Skytrax's World's Best Airline Award for a record 9th time, more than any carrier in the 26-year history of that competition. It posted a record operating profit of $4.1 billion. It carried 41.8 million passengers and moved 1.43 million tons of cargo, more than any airline on Earth, deploying all 30 of its Boeing 777 freighters to clear more than 90% of a cargo backlog built up during regional disruptions. Hamad International Airport was named Best Airport in the Middle East for the 11th year running. And while all of that was happening, a brand new airline that hadn't even sold its first ticket a year earlier had already placed firm orders for more than 150 new aircraft, backed by a sovereign wealth fund holding nearly $1 trillion in assets. That airline is Riyadh Air. It isn't trying to be the next Qatar Airways. It's building something almost nobody in Gulf aviation has tried before. And it might be the most quietly dangerous threat Qatar Airways has faced since it opened for business. Because while Qatar built an empire almost entirely out of thin air, connecting people who will never see anything of Doha except its airport, Riyadh Air is building the exact same kind of hub, on a foundation Qatar never had and structurally can't ever have. So here's what's happening. Before we get into it, if you enjoy these deep dives into the real strategy behind the airline industry's biggest names, subscribe now. This channel breaks down exactly these stories, the quiet moves reshaping entire industries every single week, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Doha sits on a small peninsula with a population of around 3 million people, most of whom aren't even Qatari nationals. There is no ancient city to see, no mountain range, no coastline that draws travelers on its own merits. What Doha has is geography, a spot almost perfectly equidistant between Europe, Asia, and Africa. Qatar Airways, founded in the early 1990s, built its entire business model around that one fact. Fly passengers in from everywhere, connect them through Hamad International Airport, fly them out to everywhere else. Almost nobody who passes through Doha is actually going to Doha. It works spectacularly. Qatar Airways now operates roughly 270 aircraft to more than 160 destinations. It's a founding-era on-world member, running around 5,500 daily codeshare flights across more than 750 markets with its airline partners, generating nearly a third of its passenger revenue that way. It runs the world's largest Starlink-equipped wide-body fleet, with high-speed internet live across its 777s, A350s, and 787s. It posted an 86% on-time performance rate this past year, and won the Cirium Platinum Award for operational excellence. Skytrax has crowned it the world's best airline 9 separate times. No other airline in aviation history has won that title as often. But look closely at what that empire is actually made of. It is, almost entirely, manufactured transit traffic. Qatar Airways doesn't sell Doha, it sells the seat between two other cities that happens to touch down in Doha along the way. That's an extraordinarily powerful business, until something threatens the one thing it depends on completely: the assumption that the region it flies through stays calm enough and cheap enough for that layover to keep making sense. Three forces are now testing that assumption harder than at any point in Gulf aviation's history. First, saturation. Dubai, Doha, and Abu Dhabi have spent 3 decades building enormous, expensive hub infrastructure to fight over the exact same pool of connecting passengers flying between Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. That pool isn't growing fast enough to comfortably support 3, let alone a 4th mega hub chasing it. Every new hub that opens has to take share from the ones already there, on largely the same city pairs, competing for the same business travelers and the same long-haul leisure passengers who could just as easily connect through Istanbul, Frankfurt, or Singapore instead. Second, and far more dangerous, geographic concentration risk. In the spring of 2026, a real military conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran spilled directly into Gulf airspace. Missile and drone strikes hit targets across the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait. Airlines were forced into daytime-only operations, long reroutes, and outright suspensions. Emirates alone saw its network capacity fall to as little as 75% of normal levels at the worst point. Qatar Airways itself said its final month of the 2025-26 financial year was affected by, in its own words, significant geopolitical events, even as it posted a record operating profit for the year overall. IATA responded by nearly halving its global airline profit forecast, from $41 billion down to roughly $23 billion. Every single one of the Gulf's 3 legacy superhubs sits inside the same conflict-exposed radius. There's no diversification available to any of them. They're all the same bet, on the same small strip of geography, at the same time. Third, capital is no longer the moat it used to be. Building a 787 or A350 costs the same whether you're a 30-year-old flag carrier or a startup 3 years old. What used to take Qatar Airways or Emirates decades of reinvested profit to build, a new entrant with a large enough sovereign check can now buy outright, in a single order, on day one. It's worth remembering that Qatar Airways itself was once exactly this kind of small, unproven, state-backed startup. It took roughly 3 decades of patient, compounding investment to become the airline that now wins Skytrax's top award almost every other year. Riyadh Air is making a similar bet, just with a far larger check and a far shorter runway in which to prove it. And one new entrant saw all 3 of those forces coming before almost anyone else in the industry, because its own chief executive had already lived through a version of this exact story. Riyadh Air didn't need to learn from watching a rival airline implode at a distance. Its CEO, Tony Douglas, was the one who did the imploding and the fixing. Douglas had already spent nearly 3 decades in aviation, transport, and logistics leadership before that, running Abu Dhabi airports, sitting on the board of Abu Dhabi Ports, holding senior roles at Heathrow operator BAA, and leading the UK Ministry of Defence's Equipment and Support Division. Douglas ran Etihad Airways as Group Chief Executive from January 2018 to October 2022, right through the Abu Dhabi carrier's worst years. When he took over, Etihad was losing $1.6 billion a year. He spent his first year cutting that loss to $1.28 billion, then to $0.87 billion by 2019, tearing through the airline's fleet, routes, and workforce in a brutal 5-year restructuring that turned Etihad from an also-ran chasing Emirates and Qatar Airways into a smaller, disciplined, genuinely profitable carrier, eventually posting a $296 million operating profit by the time Douglas left in 2022. Etihad went on to post its highest-ever annual profit of $476 million in 2024. 5 months after leaving Etihad in March 2023, the Public Investment Fund put Douglas in charge of building an entirely new airline from a blank sheet of paper, not fixing a broken one, designing one that would never need fixing in the first place. Riyadh Air saw exactly how the old Gulf hub playbook could go wrong and how expensive it is to fix after the fact. So it made a different set of choices from day one. Here's the data behind that bet. Riyadh Air is owned by Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, a sovereign wealth fund that reported roughly $925 billion in assets under management in 2025 and is targeting $2 trillion by 2030. The airline placed a firm order for 39 Boeing 787-9 Dreamliners with 33 more on option, 60 Airbus A321neos for shorter routes, and 25 Airbus A350-1000s with 25 more on option. Then went back to Farnborough in July 2026 and firmed up 28 additional 787s and 6 more A350s on top of that. Its first commercial flight, an invitation-only service on a leased 787, flew on October 26, 2025. Its first public scheduled route, Riyadh to London Heathrow, launched on June 10, 2026, weeks ahead of schedule. It's targeting more than 100 destinations by 2030. That's an airline that, less than a year after selling its first ticket, has already committed to well over 150 wide-body aircraft on top of 60 narrow-body A321neos for shorter routes, a fleet build-out pace almost no airline in aviation history has attempted from a standing start. It's also signed a 5-year partnership with GE Aerospace covering engines and maintenance support, and struck an INSAO line and code share agreement with Saudia, the kingdom's older flag carrier, so the two airlines feed each other passengers instead of competing head-on for the same domestic base. But here's the detail that actually explains why this isn't just Qatar Airways with better funding. Qatar Airways' entire model depends on passengers who have zero reason to visit Qatar itself. Riyadh Air is being built underneath a country that, unlike Qatar, already has millions of people who need to travel there every single year for reasons that have nothing to do with connecting flights. In 2025 alone, 1,673,230 pilgrims performed Hajj in Mecca in a single concentrated week. Nearly 17 million foreign pilgrims performed Umrah in 2024, a figure that's since climbed past 18 million, against Saudi Arabia's own Vision 2030 target of 30 million Umrah pilgrims a year by 2030. That's not connecting traffic passing through on the way to somewhere else. That's demand that exists purely because of what Saudi Arabia is, guaranteed every year, regardless of what's happening to global transit patterns, regardless of oil prices, regardless of which hub currently has the lowest fares. Qatar Airways has never had that. Neither has Emirates or Etihad. On top of the pilgrimage numbers, Saudi Arabia is itself home to roughly 36 million people, a population more than 10 times the size of Qatar's, most of whom already fly domestically or regionally on Saudia, and, increasingly, on Riyadh Air. Riyadh Air starts every single year with a captive, non-discretionary customer base in the tens of millions before it sells a single ticket to someone who's never heard of Riyadh. So what does this actually look like operationally? 3 things. First, a fleet with zero legacy cost. Every aircraft in Riyadh Air's order book is new generation, 787-9s, A350-1000s, A321neos. There's no aging 777 fleet to retrofit. No A380s to keep flying past their intended retirement. No decades-old maintenance contracts to renegotiate. Qatar Airways, even now, is negotiating a new agreement covering up to 210 Boeing widebodies specifically because parts of its 270 aircraft fleet need replacing, and that kind of midlife refresh always costs more and takes longer than building fresh from a clean sheet. Riyadh Air starts with none of that weight, no retirement schedule to manage, no mixed fleet types driving up pilot training and spare parts costs. Second, a hub being purpose-built rather than retrofitted. King Salman International Airport, a $30 billion project covering 57 square kilometers, roughly 14,000 football fields, broke ground in September 2025 with 6 parallel runways and 9 terminals. It's designed to handle up to 120 million passengers annually by 2030 and 185 million by 2050. And it's already been confirmed as Riyadh Air's future home. The project alone is expected to contribute roughly $7.2 billion a year to Saudi Arabia's non-oil GDP and create around 103,000 direct and indirect jobs once complete. Hamad International Airport is an excellent, award-winning facility. It also wasn't built with 2050's traffic volumes in mind the way King Salman explicitly is. And expanding an existing hub under live operations is a fundamentally harder engineering problem than designing one from an empty stretch of desert. Third, a digitally native operating model. Riyadh Air launched with no legacy reservation systems, no decades-old loyalty program architecture, no inherited IT stack from an earlier, smaller version of itself. Analysts covering the airline have compared its ambitions to a super app model, similar to what AirAsia built with Move, bundling flights, hotels, and ground transport into a single platform from day one, instead of bolting commerce features onto a booking system built for a different era. Qatar Airways, by contrast, has to run its cutting-edge Starlink rollout and Skytrax winning service on top of reservation and loyalty infrastructure that's been patched and upgraded for 3 decades. The digital equivalent of renovating an occupied building instead of designing one from the foundations up. Even the order Riyadh Air is opening routes in tells you something about the strategy. London first, to lock in valuable Heathrow slots before a use-it-or-lose-it deadline forced the airline's hand. Then Jeddah, Cairo, Dubai, and destinations across Spain and Egypt, a mix of religious travel corridors, regional feeder markets, and high-value European leisure routes, rather than an attempt to blanket the globe on day one. Qatar Airways took decades to build out to 160-plus destinations, one relationship at a time. Riyadh Air is sequencing its first routes around the exact markets its guaranteed pilgrimage and regional demand already touches, then layering long-haul ambition on top once that base is generating cash. A far more conservative approach to network building than the fleet orders alone would suggest. But the real differentiator isn't the fleet, and it isn't the airport either. It's what Riyadh Air is flying into. Qatar built an entire national identity around one airline and one airport, because Qatar itself had very little else to offer international visitors. Saudi Arabia is doing the opposite, building the airline as one piece of an entire country being turned into a destination. Riyadh Air exists inside a national aviation strategy that targets tripling Saudi airport passenger throughput from roughly 100 million to 330 million annually by 2030. Saudi airports already carried more than 128 million passengers in 2024, up 15% year-on-year and 25% above pre-pandemic levels. That aviation growth sits alongside giga-projects like Qiddiya, an entertainment city outside Riyadh built around a Six Flags theme park and a record-breaking water park, Red Sea coastal tourism developments, and a $37 billion redevelopment around the Prophet's Mosque in Medina, all funded by the same sovereign fund that owns the airline. King Salman International Airport itself is being designed as an aerotropolis, with 12 of its 57 square kilometers set aside purely for retail, hospitality, and business space surrounding the runways. Riyadh Air isn't the product Saudi Arabia is selling. It's the delivery mechanism for a country that's spending hundreds of billions of dollars making sure people have a reason to actually stay once they land. Riyadh Air isn't the only new entrant watching Qatar Airways and Emirates from the outside and sensing an opening. Ethiopian Airlines has spent the last decade quietly building the largest airline network on the African continent by refusing to copy the Gulf mega-hub model wholesale, instead building equity partnerships across a dozen African nations and running its own maintenance, catering, and training operations rather than outsourcing them. Turkish Airlines has already overtaken Emirates on fleet size and passenger volume by leveraging Istanbul's geography instead of the desert. Even Saudi Arabia's own older flag carrier, Saudia, is modernizing its fleet in parallel rather than standing still while its new sibling airline gets all the attention. Every one of these carriers is finding a different foundation to build on rather than simply outspending the incumbents at their own game. Riyadh Air is the best-funded, most aggressively backed version of that same instinct anywhere in the industry right now. None of this makes Riyadh Air's success inevitable. The challenges are real, and some of them are serious. Riyadh Air is, as of this year, still an airline with essentially one route in commercial service and a handful more being added. It has zero operating history, zero Skytrax track record, and zero brand recognition outside the region to draw on. Qatar Airways spent 3 decades building the trust that makes a stranger in Chicago or Sao Paulo choose to fly through Doha over anywhere else. Riyadh Air has to build that from nothing, in an industry where safety perception and reliability take years, not quarters, to establish. Every new route it opens has to individually clear foreign regulators, win landing slots, and prove itself against carriers with decades of accident-free track records behind them, one relationship at a time. Its own future hub, King Salman International Airport, won't even open until around 2029 or 2030, meaning Riyadh Air's entire early build-out has to run through existing, smaller infrastructure in the meantime. And the same regional conflict that hit Qatar Airways and Emirates in 2026 sits on Saudi Arabia's doorstep too. A guaranteed pilgrimage market doesn't insulate an airline from missiles and airspace closures any more than Doha's geography did. There's also the matter of execution risk at a scale almost no airline has ever attempted from scratch. Building out a fleet, a workforce, a maintenance operation, and a global network simultaneously, while your own headline airport is still years from finished, is an extraordinarily difficult operational puzzle, even with unlimited capital behind it. Riyadh Air has to recruit and train thousands of pilots, cabin crew, and engineers from close to zero, in a global market where experienced aviation talent is already in short supply, and every other Gulf carrier, plus Turkish Airlines and half a dozen fast-growing Asian carriers, is competing for the same people. And none of this happens in a vacuum. Qatar Airways and Emirates aren't standing still while Riyadh Air ramps up. Both have the balance sheets to respond aggressively on price or capacity if Riyadh Air starts winning routes that matter to them. But here's the key insight. Riyadh Air doesn't need to beat Qatar Airways at being Qatar Airways. It needs to be profitable and relevant while Qatar Airways carries the accumulated weight of 30 years of legacy fleet, legacy infrastructure, and total dependence on a region that just demonstrated, in real time, how exposed it is. Qatar Airways earned every one of its 9 Skytrax titles. That's not in question. What is in question is whether an airline built entirely on connecting strangers through a city with nothing else to offer them can keep winning forever against a rival that's arriving with a captive, guaranteed, non-discretionary customer base of tens of millions of pilgrims, a fresh fleet with no legacy costs, a chief executive who already lived through and fixed exactly this kind of crisis once before, and more capital behind it than any airline has ever launched with. None of that guarantees Riyadh Air wins. Startups with enormous funding and obvious structural advantages fail at execution all the time, and Riyadh Air still has to prove it can run a safe, reliable, globally trusted operation. not just place impressive orders and break ground on an impressive airport. But the quiet part of this story is that Qatar Airways has never before faced a rival with a home population and a built-in reason for people to travel there, backed by capital on this scale. Emirates didn't have that. Etihad didn't either. Qatar Airways built its entire winning streak in a world where nobody could make that particular move. Riyadh Air just made it. Riyadh Air isn't trying to out-Qatar Airways by copying its playbook. It's quietly rebuilding that playbook on ground Qatar can never stand on, because Qatar was never the destination in the first place. Riyadh is. Hey, before you go, the YouTube algorithm thinks you're going to like this video next, so why not check it out?